Week one overreaction season is in full effect, and we are here to bring you guys back down to earth a little bit. We're going to talk about some of our biggest risers and our biggest fallers from week one. But trust me, you're not going to hear anything crazy in this video. We're not going to be talking about, wide receiver threes that we were drafting 2 weeks ago as wide receiver ones now. But we are going to tell you some of the takeaways that do matter and some of the things that we do want to factor into our rest of season rankings. Of course, if you guys want our rest of season rankings, those will be live on the site and live in the weekly rankings tab. For our underdog code users pretty soon. So if you want those, definitely stay tuned for that. Link will be down below in the pinned comment. But before we get into it, Danny, how you doing?
Doing well, doing well. And yeah, like you said, we can take away as much as we want from week one, but at the end of the day, the Chiefs aren't going 0-17. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers aren't going 17-0. And 95% of the stuff we knew going into the season should still be held accountable. Of course, 5% you want to vary one way or another. I understand. And we'll go through that in today's video. But if you thought something pre-draft, don't let 1 week sample size completely conflict what you thought going into the season.
Yeah, Brandon Ayuk is not better than Jamar Chase. We don't have any crazy takes like that in this video, but this one should be fun, so stick around to the end. Now let's get into it. All right, so today we're going to be breaking down a couple risers, a couple fallers. We're going to go through 3 risers each and then 2 fallers each. I'm going to kick things off with the ACL Bros. Breece Hall and Javonte Williams. We had a bold prediction before the season that these guys would break the narrative. They would be the guys that crush the, running backs never perform 1 year removed from an ACL. We're not declaring victory yet, but we did see some very encouraging signs so far. With Breece Hall, we saw him have 147 total yards on Monday Night Football, despite Aaron Rodgers not really playing in the game. He had only 11 opportunities, but he looked really good on those opportunities, and that's definitely great news because Dalvin Cook, conversely, did not look very good on his opportunities, and we expect, weeks 2, weeks 3, weeks 4, weeks 5, ramp up the Breece Hall workload, and he can kind of get back to what he's doing. And then Javonte Williams had 19 opportunities in his first game back with the Broncos, including 6 targets. He only had 57 total yards, but the opportunities for him are what I really care about because he has less backfield competition with Samaje Perine. And for what it's worth, too, Russell Wilson looked a little bit better as well. So I would say stock up in general on both of these guys, and I feel more confident in them now than I did this time last week.
Yeah, and it's funny because during the game, I think I tweeted something along the lines of y'all really let Breece Hall slip to round 4+ because a lot of your home leagues, he was going in round 4. He was going in round 5. I saw him in some leagues going round 6. People were so worried about that ACL narrative. Well, guess what? That 83-yard rush included didn't really look like it was hindering him too much. And like you said, with Javonte Williams, also looked extremely efficient, extremely explosive. And I do expect that opportunity share to split or to close as the season goes along. But my first riser is going to be James Cook, running back of the Buffalo Bills. Obviously just played on Monday Night Football against the Jets. A very passionate, historic win for the Jets. Losing your quarterback, losing Aaron Rodgers in the first quarter after 4 snaps and still end up winning that game. But with James Cook, what I saw from him was a legitimate RB2 in fantasy. We saw in week 1, he had 67% of the Bills rushing opportunities, 50% of the team's routes, and actually commanded 50% of the short down and distance situation. Now, why does it matter? Why is it pertinent that he had shortened down and distance situations? Well, we expected all offseason that Damien Harris, the thicker back, 3rd and 3, 3rd and 2, he was going to get these between the tackles carries, a 225-pounder. When conversely, they were basically splitting that 50-50, like I said. And with James Cook, you're obviously getting the efficiency, the explosive play, 24% targets per route run in this game. And if he continues that role on what we project to be a top 5 offense, and yes, I project the Bills to be a top 5 offense. Another takeaway, Josh Allen's not going to turn the ball over 4 times per game. I think James Cook has the opportunity to be not only an RB2, but a potential top 15 level option moving forward.
Yeah, I think they really found the sweet spot with James Cook in terms of a workload last night. You get 12 carries, 6 targets. If we get that every single week from James Cook, we're talking about a guy that's going to be a top 20 running back in this offense. And if he has a chance to even carve out, 40, 50, 60% of the red zone work of the goal line carries, then he's going to be in a pretty good situation. So James Cook, yeah, I think he was a guy I was hesitant on coming into the season. I liked him. I thought, anytime he fell to round 7, round 8, I was willing to take him. But there were some people a little bit more aggressive on him. Some people thought he should have been like a 5th, 6th rounder. And I'm starting to see why, because he looks good. He's getting a decent workload. And he's somebody that is definitely moving up my rankings inside my top 24 running backs rest of the season.
Yep, absolutely the best Cook brother on the field last night.
Yeah, absolutely. It wasn't even a question. Dalvin Cook looked absolutely washed in that game. So another riser that a lot of people are talking about right now, especially from a dynasty lens, Zay Flowers, wide receiver of the Baltimore Ravens. Now, again, we're not going to go crazy with Zay Flowers here. We're not going to say that, in a dynasty league, we'd rather have them than Drake London or something like that,
Saw
which
some
I've
takes like
seen
that.
floating around in the Twitter spaces. But outstanding debut for Zay Flowers. Only thing I'm concerned about is how does this change when it's not a one-game sample size, and how does this change when Mark Andrews specifically is back in the fold, Rashod Bateman back to, full route participation and things of that nature. But I mean, the peripherals are great for a rookie wide receiver. Number one, to come out and command 93% of the routes is great in its own right, let alone when he commands 50% of his team's targets and has the game that he ended up having, looked explosive after the catch, got a lot of the air yards on 3rd and 4th down. He got 67% of those targets. So he was really the go-to guy for Lamar Jackson. And now with J.K. Dobbins out for the season, with Rashod Bateman, with Odell Beckham Jr. kind of working back in because they were coming off of injury, with Mark Andrews hopefully back next week, we could be looking at a much more pass-heavy unit than we were expecting. Even, we were talking about this offense going more pass-heavy, but now that they've lost their starting running back, we might even see that even more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll talk about straight up later in the video. You will hear about one of Zay Flowers' teammates as being one of my followers. But with Zay Flowers, one of the question marks I had all season, and why I had him as more of like an upside wide receiver 5, wide receiver 40, 45 range, where if you're in a pinch deep league, you could have flexed him, but realistically, you didn't want him in your lineup. Well, he just went out there and showed why he's the clear number 1 wide receiver for this team, at least for the time being. We saw the route participation clearly dominated Rashod Bateman specifically in terms of this effect. I thought going into the week that Rashod Bateman, Odell Beckham would probably be the 2 wide receivers from 2 wide receiver sets. Zay Flowers working more as that gadget slot wide receiver that's design touches, but he got the design touches. It just so happened that he was also getting top 2 wide receiver usage on this team as well. So anytime a young wide receiver, a rookie wide receiver, top 25 overall pick like Zay Flowers was, shows this capability of not only demanding targets, but downright being efficient on them, I'm buying. And I do think that going forward, he's got to be viewed as a top 30 wide receiver until he shows us anything otherwise.
Yeah, again, I wouldn't go crazy with him if people in your league are wanting you to pay like I'm trying to think of players that might be
Amari
going for him in
Cooper?
trades like Christian Watson, Amari Cooper types. I probably wouldn't go quite that crazy, but
Agreed.
if you can get Zay Flowers on the cheap for like a Mike Evans who's coming off of a big week, or somebody's trying to buy low on Christian Kirk or something like that, that would make some sense. He probably fits into that like top 36 overall wide receiver rest of season, but I am still a little hesitant to just buy all the way back in because we want to see what happens when Mark Andrews gets back on the field. But Zay Flowers, for the time being, definitely a guy that's on the rise for me. So who do you got as your next riser?
Yeah, and staying in the same game, obviously that 25-9 Baltimore Ravens win. I actually go to the flip side here with Nico Collins, wide receiver of the Houston Texans, a guy that I was already high on. He was on my sleepers video. I thought he was going to be, a very solid projection, clear-cut wide receiver 1 in Houston going into the year, but he smashed even my own expectations. We saw in week 1, the routes are going to be a little bit low, 72% here, but the wide receivers across the board for the Texans were lower. It was a blowout game. They didn't really want to, get CJ Stroud into harm's way that much, but he was still the same guy that had a 91% route participation in the preseason, and that really materialized in week 1. 28% target per route run, 26% target share in this game, and 64% of the team's air yards. I mean, anytime they were throwing down the field, 64% of the time it was to Nico Collins in that instance. Young third-year wide receiver, 6 catches, 80 yards, 11 targets in this game, really showed that he can take that next step. And I do think that going forward, we can view him as a wide receiver 3, whereas before I was like, you know what? He's probably your wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5. You want him to be like your first wide receiver off the bench. I think he could be, a relatively number 1 or number 2 level flex play going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I was kind of impressed too with what Stroud did considering the circumstance. Hopefully the Texans offensive line can hold up a little bit better than they did in that game, but encouraging to say the least for Nico Collins, continuing the dominance and the usage that we saw from him in the preseason. A guy that is a riser for me, not really a riser for you because you were much higher on him coming into the season. And also for what it's worth, if you're wondering why we haven't talked about Brandon Ayuk or Calvin Ridley yet, it's because we were already high on those guys.
Yeah.
They're not really moving in our rankings because we were already way above market. But Chris Olave is a guy that's moved up pretty significantly for me. He was a guy that I was lower on. I mean, maybe it's my Buccaneers bias. I hate the New Orleans Saints and everything they stand for, but he was wide receiver 17 for me pre-draft, and I have him at wide receiver 14 right now, but you could realistically make the argument for him at like wide receiver 11, wide receiver 12, around the like number 2 receivers, Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith, and T. Higgins, because he showed out this past week, 31% target share, got up to 84% of the team's routes, and Michael Thomas was out there, Rashid Shaheed was out there, those guys who are like target competition, quote unquote. he was still the clear-cut alpha. He actually left this game briefly too and still was commanding the targets and the routes in this one. So I'm really impressed with what I saw with Chris Olave. Am I sold on this offense? Do I think Derek Carr is going to be an excellent quarterback? And do I think this New Orleans Saints team is going to put up a number of points? Not necessarily, and I still think that limits Chris Olave's upside, but I will say he might have the talent level and the dominance of targets that still propel him to a wide receiver 1 finish despite those concerns.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, he did show it on full display. He looked like he can enter that superstar stratosphere out wide receiver. The biggest question mark I had and why I was kind of like aligned with consensus, I would say, if not a little bit lower, he was like an early to mid third round pick for me, is that I had serious question marks of, if Michael Thomas is healthy, like what are we looking at in terms of the targets there? Is it going to be like a 50-50? Is it going to be a slight lean to Olave? Or can he still dominate this team's targets? And we saw Michael Thomas, he looked good in that game against Tennessee. He played his full array of snaps. He still commanded targets. And yet it was clear as day that Chris Olave was the clear alpha of this team. And I would say like a top 24 fringe, top 16 to 20 level expectation is what I have for him moving forward. I do really like what I saw from Chris Olave. And I think going forward, you can view him as a back end wide receiver 1 with ease.
Last riser of the video, a guy that, I mean, you guys knew we were higher on to begin with, but I'll let you take it away with why Elijah Moore is even moving up our rankings, people who are already higher on him.
Yeah, and this was a guy I already thought that was a top 45 wide receiver, you know, big time, like round 9, round 10 type of value where he was going in drafts. But after what I saw in week 1, it's clear that the Browns have a clear plan for him being this team's flat out top 2 wide receiver. Like, I even think there's a possibility that he can flat out outperform Amari Cooper this year. And we saw it in week 1, like despite a monsoon, despite, you know, the Bengals scoring 3 points, 27 combined points in this game, both quarterbacks relatively struggling from a completion percentage perspective, given the weather at hand, he was still able to run 80% of the team's routes, 21 targets per route run in this game, on top of a 23% target share. And this is really impressive for a guy that we had, you know, struggles with going in. We saw the 6-game sample size a couple years ago, but has really been on and off since then. For him to come out in his first game as a Brown, show not only a top 40 level baseline, he finishes the wide receiver 40 with 9 PPR points in week 1, but the fact that when you take in the context of the weather, of the Browns offensive situation, getting off to a hot start, beating the crap out of the Bengals, wanting to run the ball down the stretch, it's even more impressive. I think that going forward, we should be looking at him as a clear-cut top 30 to 35 wide receiver with legitimate wide receiver 2 upside. I would honestly put him in the ranges of the guys like Tyler Lockett, Chris Godwin, you know, guys like that in the wide receiver 24 to 35-ish area. I think Elijah Moore has stamped his name in that area. And I do think that going forward, if the Browns offense can keep building off of week 1, can keep, you know, in better weather games, a heavy pass script going, that Elijah Moore can be an 8-9 target per game type of wide receiver.
I wouldn't quite put him up there with Godwin, but Christian Kirk, Jordan Addison, Marquise Brown type of area, I think is probably what I'm expecting out of Elijah Moore going forward. I think it's also telling that 38% of the 3rd and 4th down targets went to Elijah Moore and 33% of the play action targets went to Elijah Moore as well, which tells you that the play callers are also trusting in Elijah Moore, because usually that means he's like the first or the second read on the play if he's getting those types of targets. So really encouraging. We're not, you know, very big enthusiasts of Amari Cooper's ability to be consistent week over week. And we are big enthusiasts of Deshaun Watson at least kind of getting back to better quarterback play. I'm still a little concerned with what I saw in week 1, but again, it was a monsoon. The weather was kind of bad. And Watson, for what it's worth, he had a decent game. They won the game, get him some confidence going, and that could probably help him towards the end of the season. Quickly, we'll rattle off some fallers here. We mentioned Christian Kirk a couple times in this video, but he is falling down my rankings. I will say I still am of the belief that Christian Kirk is probably like a high-end wide receiver 3, low-end wide receiver 2 type of upside, but it is concerning that his route participation was under 70%, and Zay Jones actually led the Jaguars wide receivers in routes, because that means that Christian Kirk is probably not going to play on the outside very much. And when they go 2 wide receiver sets, he's probably going to be on the bench. Although I will say Christian Kirk and the Jags offense run a lot of 11 personnel. That's why I think he can bounce back. I still think you got to downgrade him from the potential fringe top 24 wide receiver that we were kind of expecting, especially with how Trevor Lawrence looked and how Calvin Ridley looked. If Zay Jones and Christian Kirk are going to be kind of like a wide receiver 2 by committee, and then you throw Ingram in there as well, then you probably have to downgrade Christian Kirk, because you're not going to feel as confident on a week over week basis in PPR leagues and half PPR leagues throwing this guy into your lineup. So for me, he falls from like the wide receiver 25 or 26 that I had him preseason to like wide receiver 32 kind of area.
Yeah, and transitioning to my first faller, you already sung the praises of his teammate with Zay Flowers earlier in the video, but I got to talk about a guy that I was extremely high on going into the season. That's his teammate, Rashod Bateman of the Baltimore Ravens. Now, just because he's a faller doesn't mean I have to sell him everywhere. You have to accept 70%, 80% on the dollar right now. But
People
I
are
am a
asking
little,
if you should drop him, by the way. So,
yeah.
not even just sell him. Like, people are saying, should I drop him?
Do not drop him. Do not drop him. Obviously, the week one utilization was a bit concerning. You guys can see a tweet from JJ Zachariason on the field, but basically here we saw that Odell Beckham and Zay Flowers ran 93 and 83% of the routes for the Ravens, whereas Rashod Bateman only ran 38%. Now, I do think this stems back to the fact that he was on the pup with the foot injury earlier in the preseason. Maybe he wasn't fully ramped up by week one, and that's why we saw his routes kind of diminish to this degree. But I do think for the time being, he was a guy I was comfortable plugging in as a fringe top 30, top 35 level play. And at this point, he's got to be on your bench. Like, I have to see at least that route participation come up, that target share come up for him to re-enter my lineup. Again, still a guy that I'm extremely excited upon, but I didn't expect Zay Flowers to look this good right off the bat. I didn't expect Odell Beckham to work ahead of Rashod Bateman in terms of route participation. I mean, Zay Flowers had a 47.6% target share in his first game as a rookie. Like, it's tough for me to deny. I went into the offseason thinking, Rashod Bateman may be able to contend for this team's wide receiver one across the full year. I thought he could be a legitimate top 15, top 20 overall wide receiver viewed consistently around the league when it's all said and done. But to me, knowing the knowledge now of how good Zay Flowers is, he does have to go down my rankings.
Yeah, let me ask you this question because people have asked many times if I should drop Rashod Bateman. Would you rather have Puka Nacua or Rashod Bateman the rest of the season?
If you need wins right now, I honestly wouldn't mind the Puka Nacua take. However, if you're in a team where you're only going to be relying upon this guy as your wide receiver 5, you want some stash, some upside late term, I would probably like Bateman in that circumstance. But if you need wins right now, man, like give me Puka Nacua. I think he's got a top 30 level expectation, at least until Cooper Kupp comes back.
Okay, let me ask you this as well. Rank these 3 players. A couple disappointments here. Traylon Burks, Sky Moore, and Rashod Bateman. Who do you want rest of the season? In what order?
Bateman, Burks, Sky.
Okay, so I would put Burks ahead of Bateman, but I
Yeah,
think I'm on the same page on Sky Moore there. So just curious because a lot of people have asked about
for
Rashod
sure.
Bateman and what his status is. So I think he's a decent stash, but like Danny said, if you need wins and you wanted to go after Kenneth Gainwell on the waiver wire, Tyler Algier on the waiver wire, somebody like that, I
Josh
don't think
Kelly.
it's outrageous to drop Rashod Bateman and put a guy on the end of your bench that can actually work into your flex spots or whatever if you need that. So
Agreed.
my faller or my last faller of this video is going to be Diontae Johnson, not really due to any on-field stuff because he's actually hurt. And I'm kind of just reporting an injury here. He pulled his hamstring and he's probably going to be out 3 to 4 weeks. I would imagine a lot of the fantasy docs that I've seen have mentioned that they expect him to return in week 4 or week 5. These things tend to linger, especially for guys like Diontae Johnson, who we know looks like he gets shot on every single play when he goes down. And also too, I'm not really likely to hold Diontae Johnson because I'm pretty worried about the Steelers offense from what I saw in week 1. It's the 49ers. They're a really good defense. Don't get me wrong. But if Kenny Pickett's going to look that bad and the Steelers offense is going to be that anemic, I'm really worried with Diontae Johnson because without Diontae Johnson on the field, that means that the Steelers are going to have to figure this out without their number 1 receiver. And maybe George Pickens can step up, maybe, Freiermuth or whatever, but he's banged up as well. So I just don't love the whole vibe situation around the Pittsburgh Steelers offense right now. So if somebody won in week 1 and they have a really loaded team and they're coming to you being like, hey, I'll trade you this player for Diontae Johnson. And they're thinking, oh, I'll stash him for later on in the season. I would probably just take what they give you. Maybe you can get Elijah Moore for him, or maybe you can get Nico Collins for him, or some of the guys that we've talked about in this video already. I think it sucks because he got a hamstring injury, but it's something that could linger, and I am concerned about it.
Yeah, anytime it's a hamstring injury. I mean, we were saying the same thing about Jerry Jeudy going into the season. Obviously, he misses week 1, and that was an injury that happened 3 or 4 weeks ago. He was a guy that we viewed as a top 20 wide receiver, dropped to wide receiver 33, 34 in our rankings. And Diontae Johnson, in my opinion, given the fact that the Steelers offense isn't as good as we even anticipated, doesn't hold nearly the same type of upside with a guy like Jerry Jeudy. I honestly think that rest of the season, you kind of have to drop this guy down to the wide receiver 40 to 45 range.
Yeah, it sucks. Like I said, we were a little optimistic for the Steelers offense, but it's a pretty tough division, a pretty tough AFC there that they're going to have to go up against. And I just, if you ranked the quarterbacks and the offenses in the AFC, you're probably putting the Steelers towards the middle to lower end of that spectrum because of what Kenny Pickett in the offensive line and now this Diontae injury kind of represents. So we can talk about the last faller and then we can get out of here. And a guy that you put down, I nearly put him down too.
Yeah, speaking of bad offenses, I got to go. I already talked about his teammate with Nico Collins. I got to go to Dameon Pierce, running back of the Houston Texans. He was a guy that I thought, okay, you know what, is a mid baseline RB2 projection with low end RB1 upside if the Texans offense better than I thought, if Dameon Pierce can work into full 3 downs. But we simply didn't see his role expand in week 1. We did see in week 1, 49% of the snaps, 61% of the rushing attempts, and only 39% of the routes. The routes is the big key for me. Like I saw, okay, Devin Singletary, inefficient receiver in the past, but he's got the stature that can maybe threaten. And Mike Boone, I just didn't even think was remotely worked into the consideration, but he apparently was. When I was going into the offseason, I'm like, okay, Dameon Pierce looked really good in year 1. Looked like, the tone setting back that can handle, 20, 23 opportunities per game. But the Texans clearly disagree. Like, he is fully a 2-down thumper on a bad offense. That profile typically has you in the RB20 to 24 to even RB25 plus range. So I'm really concerned that if this Texans offense doesn't improve and if Dameon Pierce doesn't work more into the routes, 39% of the routes for a guy on a bad offense is just simply not going to cut it. If you can transition off of Dameon Pierce into, like, I think you may be able to get like a James Cook type right now. I would much rather have James Cook rest of the season than Dameon Pierce. And I think you might be able to get a plus given the current market.
I think Javonte Williams is also somebody I'd be going after with Dameon Pierce. You could also make the argument that there's zero difference between Dameon Pierce and Brian Robinson rest of the season. They're both 2-down bangers for bad offenses. And honestly, Robinson actually had more of a receiving role. I'm a little worried because I was starting to get a little bit higher on Dameon Pierce, knowing that this preseason usage was like very good. And he was getting, the 2-minute drill snaps, the long down and distance stuff. But we got the game script to see exactly what that's going to look like. And it wasn't Dameon Pierce on the field. It was Devin Singletary and for some reason, Mike Boone, like you said. So not a great situation. CJ Stroud would have to play a lot better than he played. And I don't really want to expect that out of a rookie quarterback for Dameon Pierce to be anything more than like a high-end RB3, low-end RB2 on in any given week. Hopefully the Texans can keep games close. I think their defense is good enough to do that. But even still, Dameon Pierce is kind of a limited ceiling guy.
Question I got for you rest of the season. If you had a gun to your head and you had to pick one of these two, are you taking Dameon Pierce or are you taking Isaiah Pacheco?
I would take Isaiah Pacheco.
Same. I would take Isaiah Pacheco because we saw the absolute worst case scenario for him where the Chiefs aren't in an advantageous script. They're down to the Lions. They have more of the passing game work on the field with guys like Jerick McKinnon and with Clyde Edwards-Helaire coming out of the works. I don't think their situations are different. And yet one's playing for the Kansas City Chiefs on a top 3, maybe even the number 1 offense in the league when Mahomes and Kelsey are in full work. Obviously, we didn't see that on Thursday versus the Texans having maybe a bottom 3 offense.
Yeah, and I think you could make the argument that like a 60% snap share Dameon Pierce is still going to underscore a 45% snap share Isaiah Pacheco in the Chiefs offense. And like you said, it was also Pacheco's first game back too. He was like injured for a lot of the time and he barely played at all in training camp and in the preseason. So yeah, I'm on board with that take. I think Dameon Pierce, if somebody's looking to like buy low on him, quote unquote, I would probably sell him off for Javonte Williams is the perfect guy to go after because he didn't have a massive statistical game, but if you look at the underlying usage of both players, which not a lot of casual fantasy leagues are going to do, then you could probably get a very good discount on Javonte Williams. So anything else before we get out of here? Can we wrap this up?
I think we can wrap this up.
Yeah, for sure. So if you guys enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe, comment any of your thoughts down below. Who are your biggest risers? Who are your biggest fallers? Do you agree, disagree with anything we talked about? Trade targets will be coming at you guys tomorrow. So if you're wondering who you should trade for, who you should trade away, all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, matchups that matter on Thursday, running back and wide receiver tier lists Friday and Saturday as well. And then, of course, we got another week of football. We're going to get to do this like 16, 17 more times throughout the entire season. I'm fired up. I'm glad that we're talking about actual data that we got to see on the field. We're not talking about hypotheticals anymore. I am very excited about that. And, of course, if you want our rest of season rankings, if you want our weekly rankings, all the matchup charts, all that good stuff, check out Underdog Fantasy. Use the promo code FSE. You will get access to both of those. For those of you guys who have already used our code and you're wondering, oh, I don't have rest of season rankings access yet, we haven't actually made the sheet yet. So once we make the sheet, it'll be in the next coming days or so. We'll email it everybody that used our code this summer and give you guys access to that as well as anybody who is a site subscriber will have access to that as well. And if you want to check out that's flockfantasy.com, promo code FSE for 30% off. So that is the end of the video. Peace out, and we'll talk to you soon.